podcast. My name is Julia Cirillo. I'm the Water Watch Coordinator at Merri Creek Management Committee and a fellow frog lover. So I'm glad to see you all here. It's wonderful to meet you all. And I should say Happy Biodiversity Month, a very important month where we celebrate our flora and fauna, our local Indigenous and endemic flora and fauna. So it's a very, very, very important day, a very important month. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land in which I meet today, which is the Wurundjeri people, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present and emerging, as well as elders from other communities who may be with us today. As I mentioned, my name's Julia Cirillo and I'm the Water Watch Coordinator at Merri Creek Management Committee, and my role is to work with schools and the local community to raise awareness of the importance of looking after our local creeks and wetlands. I did this in a number of ways, using citizen science and working with many stakeholders, including local government, to get the best outcomes for our creeks. In the northern part of Melbourne, where I work and where MCMC is based, we're so lucky to have so many reserves, parks and waterways to explore, admire, appreciate and protect. In my local area, which is Brunswick West, I know I've been exploring my local creek, the Mooney Ponds Creek, a lot more over the past year. And when I'm out and about, I love listening for frogs. So I think it's a very exciting thing that a lot of us are already doing. I know a lot of you are doing it already, and I hope those that are new to it will start learning to enjoy learning more about frogs and how to help the citizen science program and more about how we're using the data. So today I'll be moderating the froginar, as I like to call it, and I'd like to introduce first Jane Petch, who's a Water Watch Coordinator like myself from Melbourne Water. And Jane will be giving advice about how to use the Melbourne Water Frog Census app. If you haven't used it already, it'll just be a quick one because we know some people are already using that, and why it's important to use that app. Why should we collect this data? Why is it important to know about where frogs are and the types of frogs? How to do it safely. We don't want you to fall in the creek, and with minimal ecological impact. I think that's really important as well. We all want to protect frogs and not damage their habitat too much. And why we collect the data and how Melbourne Water uses the data for its management decisions. So that'll be really exciting. And I want to thank Melbourne Water actually for funding this event today and making it possible. We also, really excitingly, have 5 wonderful other presenters, or I'm not calling them froggers, joining us today. So we'll have them in order, and there'll be time between to actually ask questions of them as well. So we've got Anna Lanigan from the Friends of Mooney Ponds Creek. Feel free to give a wave, Anna, if you'd like. We've got Robert Bender from the Friends of Wilson Reserve. We've got Tony Bracey and Jessica Slade, who are Senior Rangers at Merri Creek Management Committee. And we've got David DeAngelis, who's an environmental consultant by day and at night loves to go frog spotting. So he's on the Committee of Frogs Victoria, which was launched in 2018. And it's a great association for anyone interested in Victorian frogs. And David runs lots of frog-related citizen science projects with La Trobe Uni's Wildlife Sanctuary, and such as the quarterly frog census. So there's a number of opportunities like that people can be involved in. So the froggers are going to speak about a number of different things, but mainly their top frog spots to hear frogs and when to go. What are the main frog species you're likely to hear at those locations? Perhaps there might be some gaps in knowledge that we need some more help from you guys if you can get there, if it's in your 10Ks that you can go out there, and any other froggy questions that you have. I'll actually hand over to Jane. Thanks so much, Jane.
Lovely. Thank you, Julia. The Melbourne Water Frog Census has been going for almost 20 years, so we're about to celebrate that anniversary. And over those 20 years, about 13,900 records have been collected, which is an amazing amount of data. And this data is so important because it helps to guide the management of waterways and wetlands across Melbourne. So this information doesn't just sit in a filing cupboard and get dusty. It is actually used, and I'm going to give you a couple of examples of how we use that a little bit later on. So this is an image that shows the Frog Census app. So about 5 years ago, Melbourne Water developed an app which makes it much easier to collect data on frogs. And in a moment, you're going to hear from Anna, and she will probably give you some reflections about the early days of collecting frog data when it was necessary to go out with a pen, paper, and a tape recorder in order to collect this data. But what this app does is make it very much easier for you to go out and collect recordings of frogs. And all the data is collected together. So you can provide photos of the site where you're sampling, and you can also use the location data from your phone to provide the location for your frog data. So all of that information is very neatly packaged together when you use the Frog app. So it makes it really quick and easy to make recordings. And ideally what you would do is make a recording of 5 minutes in length, because that keeps our data nice and consistent. And you can also actually make recordings of the absence of frogs as well, because that data also does contribute to creating a picture for us. So just as a little bit of an example of what the introduction of the Frog app has done for us is that since it was introduced about 5 years ago, we've recorded 9,000 records of frog data. So you can see how it has made it much easier and much more accessible for people to collect this information. And in the census in 2017, we recorded 34 new detections of the growling grass frog. So that just shows you how important collecting data right across the whole of the metropolitan area is. We need to know where the frogs are and what species are found in what locations, because we really can't protect what we don't know about. So Melbourne Water regularly provide advice, for example, to our on-the-ground teams about particular locations where frogs are found, so that when they are conducting maintenance works, they can be really careful about what they're doing and go at appropriate times of the year that's not going to disturb frog breeding activity. So let's have a little bit of a chat about why we collect data on frogs. So without frogs, I think we would be pretty much overrun with insects. They're really important at managing a lot of insects, particularly the pesky ones that we don't like mosquitoes. They're also one of the most threatened class of vertebrates. So about 40% of frog species are threatened with extinction. So that's quite a significant fact. And another really important reason why we need to collect data on frogs is because they are really significant environmental indicators. And that's partly because they move between both terrestrial and aquatic environments. So they provide that link between aquatic food chains and what's happening on land. So that provides a transfer of nutrients from an aquatic environment into the terrestrial environment. So they really are quite a key species. So they can tell us about water quality and habitat quality. One of the important things that we do need to be concerned about as well is the spread of the Chytrid fungus, which is a significant threat to many species of frogs across Australia. So I'm just going to talk very generally about habitat needs for frogs, because I think that our frog experts that are coming along later will talk to you a little bit in more detail about the locations where they go out frogging, which will help you gain some insights into some frog habitat that's important around the Melbourne area. But frogs can be found in a diverse range of habitats, but the key thing is the presence of water. So the water doesn't have to be there permanently, but they certainly need water for breeding. So some of these, the bottom two pictures, for example, without any water, but these can still be important areas for frogs at different times of the year. So the name amphibian means is a reference to a Greek word that means two lives. So the frogs are very dependent on water, but many adult frogs spend most of their time on the land rather than in water. So they don't need to actually drink water, but they absorb water through their skin. So it's important to have moisture in their surroundings. So frogs, to avoid dehydration during dry periods, can find microhabitats that provide them with the moisture that they need. So this can include things like rogs. That's a word I've just rolled two into one.
It's a new word there, Jane.
I mean, it is a new word, yeah. So I mean logs and rocks. So any kind of little refuge where moisture might be trapped, such as grassy tussocks, mulch, and even among pot plants, frogs are quite commonly found. So any sort of little niche is going to provide an important refuge for those adult frogs.
And that's a good point you mentioned there, Jane. I think for people, even if you've got a little backyard or a courtyard or something a bit bigger, if you don't have to have a pond all the time, it doesn't always work. You might not have the space and for safety and other things, but if you have a few rocks and logs and a few little damp areas and some cover, some indigenous vegetation, you may get some frogs that way too. That might just use it as refuge just for a few months of the year, maybe not the whole time. So that's something to think about too.
Yeah, and they can be transitioning through your garden. That's right. Yep. So I've heard frogs calling in my back garden, and I don't have a pond there. So the other thing is too that some frogs are able to burrow into the soil and can refuge there in dry periods, buried in the soil. And many people, quite commonly, people will dig up frogs when they're working in the garden. So one of the species that's commonly dug up is the eastern banjo frog, or the pobblebonk, which will bury themselves. It is during the breeding season, though, that the water element does become significant, and that's when the adult male frogs will move to areas near water bodies and begin to call and trying to attract a girlfriend. And this is the time that is perfect to go out and collect some frog recordings. So if you go to those wetland areas, you can, during the evening, so just after dusk, you can regularly hear frogs calling at that time around water bodies. Sorry, I'm just going to have a glass of water because I'm choking here.
No, not a problem. I know you're nearly finished anyway, but yeah, I think that's a really good point. There's my little hint to you, but that's a really good point too, around around where you're going and being safe and at the time of day to go as well. And this is something, school holidays now, I can see we've got a few kids here too, and feel free to put your hands up too if you need to. Jess has just said you got a frog in your throat, Jane. I love that. But
it's a lovely moist habitat in my throat.
But this is a good time of the year. It's spring. We've had all this beautiful rain. We might not like to be outside, but frogs do. Put your gumboots on, put your rain jacket on, get your Frog Census app and go out exploring. This is a good time.
Yeah, and as Julia says, safety is one of those things that's really important. So we would encourage you to go out with someone else rather than going on your own. If it's an area that you're unfamiliar with, make sure you have a look at a map maybe before you go, or take a map with you. And if there's been recent heavy rains and flooding, be very wary of areas that may be flooded and avoid those areas. So this year, I think the Lower Yarra, where I'm the Middle Yarra, where I'm living currently, has flooded at least 3 times in recent times. So that's something to be aware of as well. You will tend to hear frogs calling in the evening when it's warmer. So going out on a bitterly cold, rainy night is probably not going to be a fruitful exercise. So pick those warmer evenings. It doesn't matter if it's drizzling, but if the rain is heavy, you may not hear any frogs calling. It also impacts the quality of your recording as well if there's a lot of background noise. So it's important to be aware of traffic noise too, for example. Maybe face away from the traffic when you're making a recording so that that sound doesn't come through as loud. So there are some of the things to think about when you're heading out. The other thing that is really important too is hygiene, which may not be something that you think about, but we don't want to be responsible for spreading pathogens that could be harmful to frogs. And in particular, we're talking about the Chytrid fungus, which is a disease that is a major threat to frogs.
Bit like frog COVID a bit, isn't it, Jane? Bit like COVID for frogs.
Yes, yeah, except that it impacts their skin, which is like the frog's lungs, I guess, in some ways, because they breathe through their skin. So it is an infection of their skin. And yes, quite a devastating disease. So we want to do what we can to minimise its spread. So ideally, you try and stick to paths when you're out, paths or walkways when you're out doing your recording, and avoid walking into mud. And then it's a really good idea when you get home then to give your shoes a thorough clean so that the next time you head out, if you're going somewhere different, you're not taking any contaminants with you to a new area or potential contaminants. So some disinfectant on your boots or shoes. You can use either methylated spirits or a bleach, which will effectively clean off anything that could be on your shoes.
Sorry to interrupt, Jane, but we're running out of time, so might have another 30 seconds or so to finish off.
All right. So I'll be very quick and I'll just talk very briefly about, because I wanted to let you know how this data is used. As I say, it doesn't just sit in a dusty filing cabinet. We actually use this information to guide the way that we manage waterways. Now, you may remember the fire that happened in an industrial precinct in Tottenham in 2018. When the fire happened, there was a lot of chemical runoff that went into the Stony Creek, and this was quite devastating for the creek, and it affected a 5 kilometre stretch of the creek and caused the significant loss of both plants and animals in that area. Now, there has been a very active volunteer group around that area who have been collecting frog data for many years. And the data that they collected was really vital in managing this pollution event, because the data that they collected gave us a baseline understanding of the frogs that lived in that area. So that then could help develop a management program for this site moving forward. So the data that those volunteers had collected over many, many years showed that there were a number of frog species found in the Stony Creek prior to this event. So that group then continued to collect data throughout this pollution event, and they were able to show that some frogs had in fact survived this event, and the eastern banjo frog was able to survive, quite possibly because they buried themselves in soil and had sought refuge in that way. So getting that early data about what frogs were around after the event was a stimulus to then get the local council, the community group and Melbourne Water involved in developing some off-site ponds that would create refuge for those frog species so that they could breed and recover in order to move back into the Stony Creek once the site had been cleaned up and restored. So that's just one example of how we can use that frog data in a meaningful way to guide how we manage and how we invest in waterways to protect these wonderful creatures.
Oh, hi, my name's Anna Lenigan, and I've been a frogger since 2002, which I believe was about around the first time when Melbourne Water started promoting the frog census. So it was mentioned before how technology has changed. I don't know if you can all see me when I'm speaking, but I've gone from recording with one of these to, hello, boys and girls, you probably don't know what this is. This is a cassette tape. And this is a cassette recorder, and that's what we used to use. And then we used to have to send those cassettes into Melbourne Water. And then we then went to digital recorders, which were exciting because we could send the reports directly into Melbourne Water by plugging this dear little machine into our computers. And now, of course, as you all know, we have these, which is your mobile phone, which I've just remembered I have to put my timer on, so I don't gab on too much. So that just goes to show how things have changed over the last nearly 20 years, and it's been a great ride to be along with it. Next slide, thanks, Jane. Thanks. So this is one of my, I'm going to just briefly talk about a couple of my favourite sites and why they are my favourite sites. This is Cambridge Gardens Estate, which was a new housing development, which is near Mickleham, where Mickleham Road crosses the Mooney Ponds Creek. And what you have here is about 8 years on from when it was developed, but it actually started with just a few puddles. The estate is up at the top of the photograph of the map. And so the water runoff, this was part of the deal for the estate, was to let the water run off through these little ponds into the creek and then sort of so they became what they call sediment ponds. Now, I had been recording along the Mooney Ponds Creek, which is the row of trees at the bottom of that little map, and the frogs took just 1 year to move out of the creek into the wetlands. It was just so successful. And I have to say that this is one of my, I love this spot because I have a recording which I affectionately call my Cambridge Gardens Quintet, which was on one evening when I had common froglets, spotted marsh frogs, growling grass frogs, pobblebonks, and my favourite whistling tree frogs all calling at the same time. It was just the most magic time. And I have used that recording over and over again. And I actually used to use it whenever we got round to spring census, I'd get called up by, it was Richard Akers was in Melbourne Water at the time, and he'd say, we need to promote the spring census. So I would ring up Red Simons on the radio and say, hey Red, listen to this, and I'd play my Cambridge Gardens Estate, which he would just laugh his head off. And he got so used to me, he used to call me Wacky Anna from Strathmore. Anyway, I did have one amazing incident where I finally got to meet Red face to face at the Spiegel tent in front of the Arts Centre. And as I was talking to him and telling him about my frogs, I had these two gorgeous little old ladies from Gippsland who said, oh, it's the frog lady.
Anna, sorry to interrupt you.
Gorgeous.
Sorry to interrupt you, Anna, but we've had on the chat, people are wanting to hear the recording. Is that possible?
Hi, Anna. No, actually, I have Anna's recording.
Oh, listen to that. Oh gosh, we've got a number of species there. Whistling tree frog. Oh wow. Growling grass frog. Oh wow.
So you can see why that's one of my
Thank you.
favorite recordings, and you'll love this. I was talking to the scouts one day, and I was so crazy with my saying I was so excited, and I told them, now this is my Cambridge Gardens Quintet. How many frogs can you hear? And I was lucky that the kids didn't know what quintet meant. Anyway, so that was how I got started. Cambridge Gardens is a beautiful, you can see in the photograph, there's a beautiful picnic area. It's a particularly easy spot to get to. So it's a very good spot for beginners, because when you start frogging, you really need to be at places which are easy to get to. So Cambridge Gardens is definitely one of them. But you can see, you could see in that previous slide how close those frogs were to housing. And this is the same here in Mooney Ponds Creek, West Meadows. Another very safe. You've got it goes the photograph from left to right. So you've got Mickleham Road on the left-hand side, goes down to Faulkner Road, and there's that gorgeous old bluestone building near the that goes over the creek there. It's quite historic. It's a lovely area, beautiful picnic spots, and they've just recently put in here, you can see in the photograph, some more habitat along the creek banks, which is also important, and a lovely new pathway, so that there's a really safe path all the way around the whole of this part of the Mooney Ponds Creek. And here, interestingly, I have never had the whistling tree frogs here, even though they're just upstream. But here you get the southern brown tree frogs at night, and they're a treat. And you certainly get the common froglets and the pobblebonk and the spotted marsh, which are a particular favourite of mine, which I always tell the kids sound like castanets. So you don't have to. What I'm trying to get across is you don't have to go out into the wilds and be in areas where you'd feel less safe. It's so important. The biggest thrill I have these days is finding frogs just when I walk out from my house across to the Mooney Ponds Creek, and just upstream from me where I live. We had growling grass frogs in this last year. So anytime, and now you've got the phone app, you carry that with you all the time. And so if you are lucky enough to get a frog when you're not expecting it, which was the same as I didn't expect to get them near the men's shed. I just dropped my husband off to the men's shed, and oh my God, I can hear frogs. And I rushed down and recorded them, and they were growling grass frogs. And that was really exciting. So next slide. Thanks, Joan. Nearly done. Yeah, so just quickly, this is what I do now. As my knees have got worse, I'm not really good getting out unless I'm sort of in a spot where I'm counting birds. And I have to thank FrogWatch for actually introducing me to bird data, because I got dobbed in by Richard Akers many years ago, who said, oh, well, while you're out there counting the recording the frogs, you may as well count the birds at the same time. So now I'm just as addicted to bird counts as I am, or probably more addicted to bird counts, and then I record frogs if they happen to be around when I'm counting birds. But I was very proud of this. This is my photograph of a growling grass frog, and this is actually on a metal signpost at West Meadows, the previous slide where we just were. And so here we are using our experience to be in the education role. So there's nothing I like better now than to go to a school, go to this. We haven't been able to do that this last 2 years with COVID, and I really miss it. But I love talking to the school children. I love talking to the scouts. I love talking to any group who just want to know a little bit more about our wonderful frogs and what we can do to record them, to promote them, to make their habitats safe. That's enough from me.
That's wonderful, Anna. Thank you so much. I think we can all agree we love your enthusiasm. I can see you getting some rounds of applause. We've got Robert Bender coming up next, and I think Robert's going to share his screen. So while Robert's getting set up, I can see there's a couple of questions we've got through the chat. So I can see we've got a lovely Nellie who's 4 years old. So some of you froggers might be able to answer this question. I don't know if I can. How do frogs know the difference between mud and dirt? I'm not sure if that was in reference to something that Jane was talking about before. Anyone, any froggers want to answer that one? I don't know if they can tell the difference.
I'd say to the little one, good question. But I think what they do know is that the mud is wet. So they've got very beautiful sensors on the ends, on the tips of their toe pads. They've got sensors, so they know when the time is right, and they can tell the difference between dry and wet. That's one thing that I'd like to add, that frogs have this amazing ability. When there's times of drought, they actually go somewhere, they bury themselves and they hibernate. And then when they know it's wet and it's mud, then they'll come out. I remember when the drought broke in 2007, we had Jacana Wetlands. They were driving trucks over it. It was so dry. And then when the rain came in 2007, within 2 weeks, that wetland was full of frogs. They were there somewhere hiding. Good question.
Yeah, it's an excellent question and an excellent answer, I must say. Thank you so much, Anna. Oh, you're welcome, Nellie. You're welcome, darling. Now, Peter was also asking me, Peter and I were having a chat on chat about how do I start to get to know the frogs. And yes, you can certainly download the app and record them and get outside. But even if that's a little bit tricky, come out with one of us, come out with Anna, come out with me. I run a lot of frog census activities. So does David. All the froggers actually go out and do frogging, and we do advertise our events on Facebook. I have a frog list on the Merri Creek Management Committee whenever we have activities, when we can run them again, of course. So come along with us. That's how I learned. I went out with experienced froggers, like Robert Bender was one that I went out with, and that's how I learned on the job. So perhaps that's a good way to start. But also, yeah, take the frog app down, go and listen to some frogs and just go and play them and just see, oh, which one does that sort of match up with. There's also a good app that the Australian Museum has put out called Frog ID that has a bit of a, you can play it and it tries to guess which frog it is. So that can be a good app to use as well. But anyway, I will let Robert talk. Thanks, Robert.
Thanks, Julie. Well, I live in Ivanhoe. Been there for 35 years and been doing frog surveys for a fairly large part of that time. This is the area I survey. You can see my little cursor here. Where the sea is, that's my house. I just walk down this road and there's the Yarra. The Yarra flows from right to left down towards the bay. This is Wilson Reserve, which is the area that I'm mainly interested in. And the interesting thing is over here is a billabong. It's called Reedy Billabong. Here is Bailey Billabong. Here is Horseshoe Billabong. And this is a half billabong, which is right in the middle of the golf course. An earlier incarnation of the golf course management thought billabongs were just crap. They tried to destroy this one and they were stopped about halfway through. So this is now just a half billabong, but it's actually full of water at the moment and it's full of frogs. The golf course now has about a dozen little water hazard ponds in between the fairways, and my frog survey consists of going around these 3 billabongs and about 12 ponds on the golf course. It takes about 2 hours. So this is the little map that's on the golf course scorecard. All the numbered circles are the fairways of the golf course, and the unnumbered, so the uncircled numbers are the ponds that they excavated about 20 years ago. And the thing that really amazed me is when, as soon as these ponds filled up with water, frogs discovered them almost overnight. Absolutely astonishing. So I've been doing surveys every month, haven't missed a single month since September 1998. Went for a walk with a friend one night and I thought, that was good fun, I'll do it again. And I've been doing it again 277 times, so great fun. I usually do it as soon as possible after rain. Like if it rains tonight, I'll probably go tomorrow night. Once a month is enough though. It's obviously produced a pretty big database. I've got a spreadsheet that's almost a megabyte. I've found 8 species of frogs, and you can see some are more abundant than others. If you can add up all those numbers, it's about 30,000 frog records over 23 years. The most abundant by quite a long way is the brown tree frog, and the smooth froglet is next, and the dwarf tree frog and the Perrins tree frog are relatively uncommon in the area. Their presence is increasing quite substantially. I went along to the launch of Frogwatch about 10 years ago, and there was some information that was made available about the results overall for the previous 2 years, and this was the result for Greater Melbourne. The common froglet, it earns its name by being very common. There are 3 other very, very common species, brown, banjo and spotted frogs, and the other 11 frogs are fairly uncommon. That's for Greater Melbourne overall.
Sorry to interrupt you, Robert. We've actually got a couple of questions for you.
Okay.
Joe's just asked, during the COVID period when the golf course was largely closed, were you noticing anything about the frog habitats when the usual human impacts had lessened? Was there any change in the data or not?
The human impact has actually increased. It's now just a standard dog walking area. So the golfers have to pick up dog poo, which is great fun.
Yeah.
And lots of golfers are still going there. They don't need to pay for their golf, and they just, because there's no people wanting to come through, they can practice their putting to their heart's content. So it's actually still a very, very busy place.
So it's very busy and it's probably still having an impact. And we've certainly noticed that on the Merry Creek and the Mooney Ponds Creek, that there's actually more people now. I'm sure you've all noticed that during COVID rather than the other way around. So that's obviously having an impact on animal species as well.
Yeah, the main thing that has the impact is whether it's wet or dry. When you get a really decent rain, you get heaps of frogs. And if you get a little teeny weeny bit of rain, there's hardly any frogs. And if you get no rain, there's no frogs. So
yeah,
they're mainly sensitive to rain.
That's great. And Finbar and Nora have asked, and anyone can answer this, but I'm sure you can tell them, Robert, when's the best time of day to hear frogs?
Exactly as Anna was saying, not long after sunset. I usually go, as I said, it's a 2-hour walk usually. On a very, very busy night, like I think the busiest night, I estimated about 700 frogs. And it just takes a long time to get an estimate for any one water body. I've got about 20 water bodies to visit, and it usually extends to about a 3-hour walk. And I want to get to bed at a reasonable time, so usually fairly soon after sunset, because the pobblebonks and the smooth froglets will call during the day, but all the other species just won't call during the day. They only call at night. So there's just no point in going around during the day. The later at night, the better. But at the same time, you've got to get up the next morning, so I need to get to bed. So it's a compromise. So I try to be home by 10:30 or so and clean up and go to bed. But so soon after sunset, which means you've got to organise dinner and other chores around that. So these green columns are what the abundance of species that I have found. You can see the abundance, the relative abundance, is quite different in my area from Melbourne overall. The brown tree frog is much more common than the common frog. The striped marsh frog is much more common than the pobblebonk, and the smooth froglet is quite surprisingly common compared to Melbourne overall. So one of the really important reasons for doing these surveys in lots of parts of Melbourne is that the mix of species you get is different everywhere you go. And one of the things Melbourne Water would find really useful is to know what is the different mix of species in your area. As I said, I've got several billabongs that I visit and lots of ponds on the golf course, which have all just got numbers on them. And you can see the billabongs are the really big source of frogs, especially Bailey billabong. That is the most precious resource for frogs in my area. They're obviously big water bodies, they've got heaps of water in them, and most importantly, they hardly ever dry out. Horseshoe is usually dry. It's quite full at the moment. Bailey billabong and reedy billabong are actually fed by drains that bringing down a lot of storm water, and they're quite abundant because of that. They're almost always full. Horseshoe is more often dry than not. Otherwise, it would be up there with Bailey billabong. But the golf course ponds are much less abundant in frogs. These ones that I've coloured red, they're all joined along the road that I walk down to get into the area, and they're joined by underground agricultural pipes, and therefore, in effect, they're a single water body, and they're just chockers with mosquito fish. Mosquito fish eat frog eggs. So it's only the stupid frogs who don't want to leave the next generation that go into these ponds, and they just never establish big populations, which is why there's so few there. It's not that they're not nasty ponds, it's just they've got this rotten fish there that's an exotic imported pest. This is Bailey billabong, which I took last week. It's quite full now because the recent rain we had has filled it up, and it's just a glorious place for frogs. I've heard pretty much all 8 species in there. Which is just really beautiful. So sitting there, and because it's a really long billabong, it's about 300 metres from end to end, the frogs calling at one end can't be heard from the other end, so I stop at several spots around the billabong to record what I've found. This is just one of the ponds on the golf course. They're normally probably 20 metres by 30 metres, something, quite small bodies, and they dry out. All of the ponds have dried out at times, some much more than others, and therefore they're much less reliable habitats for the frogs. But they're all surrounded by really beautiful native vegetation. There are three species of tree frog in the area, and you can see the tree frogs have got little sticky toe pads on their tips of their toes, which are quite sticky, which means they can climb vertical surfaces. And so the ones you're likely to find in household tile surfaces, ponds, are tree frogs, because they can stick to the surface and get out, not drown. Whereas ground-dwelling frogs, you can see, have really long, pointy toes. And the difference between tree frogs, which are quite slender, because if you're really obese, you can't climb a tree, and ground frogs, which don't need to climb trees and are always very, very obese, because it doesn't matter for them, because all they're going to do is just sit around and grab insects anyway. Recognising the differences is quite simple. And this is a little froglet, tiny. As you can see, it's about the size of one joint of my finger. Again, long pointy toes, they can't climb trees, they're just ground frogs. And the smooth froglet, the giveaway sign is this orange patch in the groin. If you can find one of those, then you know you've got a smooth froglet, dark flecks all over, so really obvious. So some stuff about what I've found. The brown tree frog, which is the most abundant frog I find, you can see calls from roughly July to December. So they're at their peak right now, and I'm hearing them every time I go out. They love the billabongs, which billabongs are really precious for these frogs, but they're also pretty keen on most of the ponds as well. So they're not fussy about what sort of water body, big, small, doesn't matter, they'll go there. The striped marsh frog, which is also a spring and summer caller, quite different from the pobblebog, because it's got this golden stripe down the middle of its back, which is just lovely. The Perrin's tree frog only appeared in 2004, and they're entirely a summer caller. I usually hear them from November to January. And they've got this really strange cross-shaped pupil on their eyes. It's really bizarre. This is a photo I took because one was calling about 10 centimetres from my head one night. I just turned the camera around and there it was. The eastern dwarf tree frog is an invader from Queensland, which is a real problem, because Queensland is where the Chytrid fungus was first established, and all the ones that are brought down in banana boxes are bringing the Chytrid fungus with them. 4 species have come from Queensland. 3 of them apparently had fairly narrow temperature tolerances, and they couldn't establish populations here through our cold winters, and they just died out. But the dwarf tree frog seems to have quite a wide temperature tolerance, and it has established populations right across the eastern suburbs of Melbourne. It's called a dwarf tree frog because it's really tiny. It's about the size of my little fingernail. Really teeny weeny little frog, but it's got an amazingly powerful call. And you can see it's also a summer caller. The dwarf tree frog I originally found in Bailey Billabong, and it just sat there and did nothing, like a single frog for several years. And then we had a bit of a flood, and it just got flooded up to some of the ponds on the golf course and stayed there. I thought it was a pretty good water body as well. There's what you might call a sleeper species. They start in one area, seem to do nothing for several years, and then suddenly explode. Looking at the different species, the brown tree frog is really abundant in Bailey Billabong and somewhat less abundant in other places. The smooth froglet was almost entirely in Bailey Billabong. It doesn't seem to like the ponds much. The striped marsh frog seems to like pond 12 for some reason. It's full of reeds, the other ones aren't, so it likes lots of vegetation to hide in. The spotted marsh frog seems to like pond 9 because it's very shallow. It doesn't like steep water bodies, it likes shallow ones. So the different habitat preferences of different frogs are really interesting to discover. I didn't know any of this when I first started surveying my frogs. It's something I've figured out along the way. So one of the good reasons for doing this for a very long time is you learn about what excites particular frog species and why they like this and not that. The common froglet, you can see, is very abundant in quite a few of the golf course ponds, and I almost never hear it in any of the billabongs. It seems to like small, fairly shallow water bodies, doesn't like these great big water bodies. By contrast, the smooth froglet is really abundant in the billabongs and doesn't seem to like golf course ponds. So you've got these quite different preferences. One likes ponds and one likes billabongs, which again is a big surprise to me. How can they tell what sort of water body it is? But obviously they have some way of telling. The spotted marsh frog is again a spring and summer caller, and it's almost entirely in one pond, which is very, very shallow. It's maybe 5-10 centimetres deep when it's really, really full, as opposed to others which are a couple of metres deep. It seems to like this shallow habitats. Melbourne Water has pretty much from the start, from 2002, asked people to go out in April and September. So why do they do that? Because that's when there's heaps of frogs. all the other months, there's far fewer frogs. So if you want to get all the frogs there are, they're the 2 best months to go. Now, I don't think that's anywhere near enough. I think it's much, much more fun to go out 12 times a year. So I've been doing it 12 times a year for 23 years now. And what you can see is the billabongs are really busy in April, but the ponds aren't, because that's when the smooth froglet is at its peak, and it likes the billabongs and doesn't like ponds. Whereas in springtime, they're both very, very busy. So this time of year, I hear heaps of frogs everywhere I go. Virtually every water body is just bouncing with frogs. And this, just to finish off, is a really bizarre thing I found one day when I was out weeding. I pulled away these weeds and there was this white thing, and I picked it up and it was a frog. It was a bubblebonk. It's not an albino because it's got some melanin pigment, and that's mainly around its eyes, so its eyes are normal. Albinos are normally very, very short-sighted. They can't see because the pigment is what helps you have depth vision. But this was almost completely an albino, really bizarre. But I just took lots of photographs and sent it off to the Melbourne water people at the time, and they were astonished because no one had ever seen one of these. It's called leucistic. It's just the word term for partially albino. I looked up leucistic because I'd never heard of it before and discovered this. There are lots of records of leucistic animals, and they're almost all reptiles and birds. So leucistic frogs is apparently a fairly new experience. Leucistic mammals hardly exist at all. So the genetic variation, which leads to this bizarre aberration, is quite unusual.
Wow. Thank you so much, Robert. That was fantastic. That's fantastic. Thank you so much for that. Amazing collection of data, I'm sure you'll all agree. And look, I'm a data queen. I love data. And it's really great to see that and those really clear distinctions of the species and what habitat requirements they have.
Hi, everyone. We're Jess and Tony, and we work for Merri Creek Management Committee on the Ecological Restoration team. And we've been monitoring for about 5 or 6 years, particularly while we've been working on the Merri. So here I've just got a couple of the main species that we see on the Merri. The top 3 are the most common, but we do have records on the Frog Census App of all of these things. And here we've just got a map. If you go from like the left to the right, I've just gone from north to south. I just wanted to highlight some of the main areas that are good for frogging. So the first bit is the Upper Merri Wetlands. There's a series of like wetlands north of the ring road that are quite good for that. Mooney Park, which I'll talk about in a second, is very good. And then down behind Bubba-Bidjin and Ann Grassland, there's records, special mention to Edwards Lake. Unfortunately, that's kind of cut off by a road, but you still hear lots of frogs there. Oh, wrong one. Merri Edgar's confluence. There's a wetland there in between where the creeks meet. Heading to the other map, Straddle Street Wetland is great. Jones Park, there's a pond there at the end of Albion Street. All the ponds at Ceres and Merri Park Wetland. I'll talk about that too. No, Tony will talk about that.
Yeah, sure.
Pardon?
I will talk about that, yeah.
And then I just wanted to also mention there's 2 at least ponds at Yarra Bend Park on that west side of the Merri Creek, and Alphington Wetlands is pretty good. But we also have a very special frog species that's been recorded recently called the Growling grass frog. Here's some pictures of it. It's a pretty interesting frog. It likes to sunbake during the day, and mostly it's been recorded in the summer months in kind of November to January. So here's our first spot. This is the map on the right is just like a zoomed in version of the map on the left. And all of those yellow spots are our recordings. So Merri Creek Management Committee and Darwin Creek Management Committee's recordings. And so Mooney Park here, I just wanted to kind of highlight how you get there. So if you're driving, I would be going up Sydney Road and turn right on Anderson Road and go east kind of to the end where it bends. And then if you follow that blue spotted line into the car park, that rectangle is just a car park that I put in. And then go down that pink line, that is there's like a set of steps there. Sorry, put my phone on. so I would follow that down, because that is where those 2 yellow spots there, that's kind of where Tony and I heard the growling grass frog in January 2019. And on the same day, our friend Pip, our colleague Pip, heard the frogs in the north there, kind of where that love heart is. And she actually thought it was sheep in the creek, and that's kind of plausible because if you look up there, there's sheep paddocks opposite, but they were growling grass frogs. That green love heart is just the site of a new wetland that's going in at the moment, which is pretty exciting and probably going to be very good for habitat there. So growling
activity there before the wetland, so who knows what it's going to be like with the wetland.
Yeah, it'd be great to get them to expand out. So I've just added an image here that I took from the DELP strategic assessment of ideal habitat. So they love still or slow moving water, lots of aquatic vegetation in the water, and it's important that it's near open grasslands because that's where they like to hunt for insects. And this is what it looked like on the day that we heard them. So you can see on the left there that there's lots of open grass. All of those kind of things are mostly addressed. And we've got those wetland species there. Phragmites, which is our common reed, and triglocan, which is important in stream vegetation. I just kind of wanted to share with you some audio of that day. They're pretty loud. I hope you can hear them. Can you hear that? Oh no.
Growling grass frogs, wonderful.
I think they were loving the heat. So that was taken in January, and it was a stinking hot day. There was no wind, and they were really loud. You can't really tell, but their voices really carried, and they called all day. And we called immediately. I took a video for the Frog Census App and called Michael, our boss, who got really excited. But it's interesting that they're here because Moomba mostly fits with typical growler habitat, but it's only really still here quite rarely, especially with those engineered banks on the side, because any rain kind of just goes straight into the creek. And very little emergent or floating vegetation except for at this spot, and that's really important for protecting tadpoles and egg masses. And there are reeds there which will protect the adults from predators, and dense grasses and shrubs on the banks that protect the froglets. But the grass structure above that is too dense to provide good foraging habitat for them. Typically, they need a shorter, more open grass structure. But this stretch is quite deep and it's quite open compared to the other parts. And there's a couple of scattered rocks further downstream. And just in conversation with people from work, it's possible that they've been washed downstream from more suitable habitat north of the ring road. But the fact that they've been recorded there for 3 years in a row suggests that they could be successfully breeding at Moomba Park. And maybe there are suitable habitats, suitable foraging areas further along the creek in either direction. But I'm curious if they've been recorded after 2020. Yeah, that's last year. Any further south than about Breck's Court in Reservoir. And also curious about the impact of those 4 industrial fires after 2017. I don't know if anyone remembers, but there was that factory stockpiling chemical waste that went up in Campbellfield. That was only 3 months after we recorded it. But yeah, obviously other frog species live here too, not just the growlers. There are banjo frogs, spotted and striped marsh frogs, common froglets, and southern brown tree frogs. Tony?
Yeah, that's That's good. And this is a little bit closer to where we're situated in Brunswick East. So this is the Mary Park Wetland. It's quite close to Northcote High School. I don't know. See that on the map somewhere. It was constructed as a flood levee to stop some of the water coming up when the creek's at its most aggressive. It's pretty occupied by kids and whatnot and the public, but you seem to get pretty consistent frog populations. I know I was there quite recently after the rain and I could hear quite a few frogs in the small little wetlands there. It goes to show that things can, I'm under the impression that frogs are quite delicate, but they seem to be surviving in any sort of suitable habitat. And this is, I mean, there's a resident tiger snake, I think, that's in the area that obviously is predating on something to keep it there. So it's, yeah, it's, as we were saying before, you don't need to go to these really far away, perfect places to find frogs, because they really will find you if the habitat's, if it's suitable. And I think now having a lot more people walking along the creek and utilizing it in this like COVID period, that incentive to get people to just open their ears a little bit more to take notice of what's around, I think is, again, falling on a lot more ears than it might have been a few years ago. So yeah, I think it's a pretty wonderful little a little spot, and quite similar to Moomba, where it's close to an oval. There probably wouldn't have been too much in the early 80s. It would have been quite cleared. And now with community interest and action from groups and friends groups, that we've been able to establish it with the planting, and then you can see all the other things that come with that. And I think frogs are a great example because they're a wonderful indicator of biodiversity in an area. So I think, yeah, having people in urban areas, keeping their ears open for these sort of things, and kind of finding what spots they can hear frogs. And I think once people get an idea of where the habitat is, they will kind of see it a lot more on their own walks and their own little discoveries. And yeah.
I kind of wanted to point out the habitat here. So compared to the other spot, which was quite deep, if I go to the next slide, here's like a little map that I've drawn up of what it looks like. So there's a lot of ponds and they're quite shallow and easy to get into. Yeah, sorry. Go on, Tony.
No, I'm just saying it has a lot of activity, and you can see how close it is to all these houses and all the runoff that you're probably going to get from the water, which again which why you don't hear as many things coming from the creek versus the small wetlands around it. It's a bit more unpredictable with the amount of water that goes in and out of the creek and the speed that it flows, that these sort of safer wetland areas are probably much more suitable for your frogging.
Yeah. So these are kind of the species that we're seeing there at Mary Park. Do you want to talk a little bit about them, Tony, or not really?
They've been covered probably quite extensively.
Yeah.
By
I might just talk about
this round table. And
the size, you can't really tell the scale there, but the common froglets on the left at the top, they're quite tiny, and the popplebongs are huge, that one next to them. Anyway, and this is kind of what Mary Park looks like. It's quite low, grassy kind of habitat. Go on, Tony.
Yeah, see perfect little spots for these three species that we come across pretty regularly. We definitely hear the most.
Yeah, I might just mention the time of year to go and hear these frogs. So of course, everyone else has mentioned, go at dusk, particularly on a warm evening. Just watch out for tiger snakes because they go to bed when the sun is, when it's not when the sun is setting, but when it's cold. So just watch out there. But yeah, it's a great little spot. It's full of woodland birds as well, and we get lots of migratory kingfishers, and I think they're actually just attracted to the frogs. Little captive population. Anyway, that's it from us.
One of the best resources I've ever come across was produced for the Frog Survey. It's this book.
Yeah, it's a great
one. Frog Watch Guide to Frogs.
It's been out of print.
It's been out of print for 20 years. But somebody turned it into a PDF file. It's available to download off the web, and it's absolutely brilliant. So if you want a really good resource, download the PDF for the Victorian Frog Watch Guide.
Fantastic. So I think Jane is sharing the screen for David, is that right? And David, you've got your PowerPoint to go, and we'll hear from you. Thanks so much.
All right, so one of the good things about going last is that some of what I was going to be rambling about is being covered already by some of the other presenters. So hopefully that'll speed things up a little bit. I won't dwell too much on my background. Suffice to say that although some people maybe refer to it as a passion, if I'm honest, frogs are really an obsession for me. So ever since I can remember, so going back to before primary school, but maybe I'll leave it at saying that at primary school, I remember picking up squashed spotted marsh frogs off the basketball courts, but I certainly wasn't playing any sport. Not that that's necessarily the best thing at that age, but following that into high school, like Anna, I became involved in the frog census more or less since its inception. So in 2001, 2002, dragging other willing or not so willing students around the place, trying to record calls on the cassette tape, and that Melbourne Water would send out in a package with the hard copy data sheet. And as a student group, we were contributing records to the census. But as Julia mentioned, since then, I'm ashamed to say my involvement with the Melbourne Water's frog census hasn't been as often, apart from, like Julia mentioned, at La Trobe Uni's wildlife sanctuary. So outside of COVID times, obviously, we invite people from the local community as well as students along to take part in our quarterly frog census at La Trobe's Wildlife Sanctuary. But aside from that, in my role working mainly as an environmental consultant, I tend to go out to areas where we find some of our unfortunately less common frogs, including threatened species like the growling grass frog that Jess and Tony just covered pretty comprehensively in their presentation. So we won't spend too much longer on this side, apart from saying it's difficult to, if you want to see a frog like the growling grass frog, given that it's a threatened species, find a site that you can easily get access to them or see them. Harder than it is for some of the other more common frogs, for a few reasons, not just because they're rarer, so harder to find, but there are also some concerns that I'll talk about around having too many people visiting sites where these sort of frogs are found. But there are some that are possibly safer to do that sort of thing. And one that I'll talk about is the Western Treatment Plant at Werribee. So what some people affectionately refer to as the poo farm. So maybe surprisingly, it's possibly one of the best, if not the best spot in Victoria for growling grass frogs. And I'll mention a little bit about getting access to that if people are interested. I won't spend much time on the Middle Yarra Billabongs because that's the area that Robert focused on, that he spends most of his time surveying around Wilson Reserve and surrounds. But as you've heard from Robert, a really good spot to pick up a wide variety of frog species. A good representation of what we have in Melbourne. But what I'll spend most of my rest of my 8 minutes talking about are frogs and sites that might be more of a priority for people to survey. If some of you live closer to these areas, or once COVID restrictions eased, might be inclined to go out a bit further and survey, because there hasn't been as much effort recording frogs at the particular sites that I'll mention. Okay, so if we go to the next slide.
This is what we want, gaps. Where's our gaps in knowledge?
Okay, so there are three frogs that I'll mention, and this is based on discussions that have been held internally within Melbourne Water, but also with people like myself and other experts and consultants as to where some of these gaps are. So Jessica and Tony talked about the Merry Creek and its importance for the growling grass frog. And in northern Melbourne, they come about as sort of far east as the Darebin. They're also found way southwest of Melbourne in the Pakenham Cooey-Rupp area. But the reason I haven't got the Merry and Darebin creeks listed here up to the north of Melbourne is because those catchments are going to be resurveyed this season by arguably and rightly so, the authority on growling grass frogs, the guru, Dr. Jeff Hurd. And he's been surveying for that species, apart from during his PhD, for the past 20 years, give or take. And he's going to be resurveying the Merry and Darebin creeks this spring and summer for the growling grass frog. But what DELP would like, and in collaboration with Melbourne Water and others, is for citizen scientists and people who take part in the frog census to look for growling grass frogs and record them in the other catchments to the north and west of Melbourne. So we've got a few of them listed there. Mooney Ponds, which unsurprisingly Anna's very familiar with, playing a role in the Friends there, and the Steel and Deep and Jacksons and Corraloit Creeks, etc. There are a few other spots, though, where growling grass frogs have turned up that maybe they were a little bit less expected to. So in the middle and upper Yarra catchment, they were known up until the early 2000s, and then not really since then. And the Chytrid fungus that Jane and others have talked about a main reason for that, or at least thought to be. But they turned up around Coldstream only a couple of years ago. And so it'd be good to get more survey in that area, although access can be difficult because a lot of the water bodies in that part of the Yarra are on private land. So there's not as much public access up there. I mentioned to the southwest of Melbourne, so Cardinia Creek and Bunyip River, but also way out to the west in the Werribee and Little River catchments, groups like Moorabool Environment Group, increasingly trying to get or build the number of records for growling grass frog in that area, because there haven't been as many. And you can see the Werribee treatment plant in the southwest, which I mentioned is a good reference site. The only thing is, if you want to see growling grass frogs there, you'll either need to go disguised as a birder or a twitcher, because you can get a birding permit to visit the treatment plant. And although Jess mentioned that they do bask during the day, so there's a chance you'll see them when you're able to access the treatment plant in the day, they are more active generally at night. So you won't be able to access the treatment plant after dark much, if at all. But they are present where the Werribee River and the Little River sort of enter the bay to either side of the treatment plant. Okay, next slide. So how do we go about, as citizen scientists, contributing records for the growling grass frog specifically? So Department of Environment, as I mentioned, in collaboration with Melbourne Water's Frog Census program, so it's using the app, you can contribute records as you usually would using the Frog Census app. So this is a new program that they've just started called Gong Growling. And to find out more, you can go to the department's website. and they'll explain how you can become involved in that program. But as I say, it's fairly straightforward. You're just using the Frog Census app to record the calls and submit them in the way that you usually would. Okay, next. Okay, so now I didn't play the call of the growling grass frog because Jess did such a fantastic job, but I might very, very quickly do for this one, the southern toadlet. It's nowhere near as elaborate. So this is what a southern toadlet sounds like. Hopefully you can hear that. Yeah. And not only does it have a less conspicuous call, but it's also a lot more secretive and a bit harder to find. They don't show themselves off. They stick under the leaf litter and the grass. So we've got a few priority sites in the southwest that haven't had a lot of survey effort recently. So we know they exist in these areas, or at least they've been there historically. So on French Island and along the Basque Coast and on the peninsula, for those of you who maybe live closer to the southwest of the Greater Melbourne area, or once COVID restrictions ease, as I mentioned, you know, for those who like travelling to this part of the world, then southern toadlet might be a species for you to listen out for. The only other catch is it's an autumn breeder, so you won't record it if you're there in spring and summer, like you will for a lot of other frogs, like the growling grass frog. So each of these species call at slightly different times of year, although most of them do in spring. This one definitely doesn't. It's an autumn breeding specialist. Okay, next.
I'm sorry, David, is this the last slide? We're just really going over time.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah, second last. We'll, yeah. All right. This one's even harder to find. So there aren't a lot of records of it contributed to the frog census for that reason. And maybe I'll leave it at explaining that the close relatives of this frog, the common spadefoot toad in Western Australia, so researchers at the Uni of Western Australia have found that they can spend up to a year and a half, potentially up to 2 years underground without emerging, or before they come up and breed after there's been enough rain for them to. So maybe it's not surprising that there aren't a lot of records of this frog around Melbourne. But it's possible they've disappeared from some areas as well. Interestingly though, only this year, with all the rain that we have, given that it's maybe just slightly above average year of rainfall so far, they've turned up in some unexpected places, including Royal Park, but also the Sandbelt to southeast of Melbourne, which they were known from historically, but there have been a few turn up recently there as well. They used to be recorded, believe it or not, in the parklands along the Middle Yarra, around Westerfolds. A well-known ranger at Parks Victoria, Cam Beardsell, found a few of them there in the 1990s, but they're still currently known from the plains around the Merri Creek. So the area that Jessica and Tony and Julia work, we know that they're still hanging around up there. And if you wanted to increase your chances of finding them, then maybe that's the spot to go. Having said that, the best time to look for them, given they're so hard to find, is after really substantial rain, or even, you know, when the landscape's flooded. Okay, next. Okay, lucky last. So again, we won't dwell too much on this because some of these points have already been covered. So Jane mentioned you're recording for 5 minutes if you can, and I think the census is set. The app to record for that long, and that's for scientific reasons. You know, it's good to have everyone recording for the same time, but no matter whether or not, you're recording frogs. So something else that you mentioned, Jane, is that absence data is also important. So even if you record for 5 minutes and you don't record any frogs, it's still important to submit those records because it still tells Melbourne Water something. That you haven't obviously recorded any frogs at the time you were there. And we've also talked about the importance of visiting sites on more than one occasion. Robert sort of emphasised that in particular, but including different seasons when these different frog species are going to be active. And if you're targeting a particular species of frog, like the southern toadlet or the growling grass frog, look at the season when they're going to be calling. These two are particularly important, and also from the perspective of experts, at least some experts in the Department of Environment. So something that they're not keen on is to have a lot of people, too many people, visiting certain sites, and particularly sites where rare or threatened frogs are surviving, and mainly for want of avoiding too many impacts to the habitat. So not having too many people trampling habitat for the frogs, but also to reduce the risk of spreading disease, you know, the Chytrid fungus that Jane and others have talked about. And so for that reason as well, keep those hygiene procedures in mind that Jane mentioned. So Chytrid fungus at no stage of its life cycle can survive if it's completely dry. So if your gumboots don't have any mud or water on them and they're 100% dry, there's no risk of transmitting Chytrid fungus. So you either have to make sure that your boots, your gear are completely dry, including, you know, car tyres if you're driving next to a site with a frog like the growling grass frog, to protect it. But other than that, like Jane mentioned, sterilise or disinfect your equipment and your boots. And if you wonder, you know, you could use straight methylated spirits. The concentration at which it's effective is actually 70%. So although it's called metho, it's actually mainly ethanol in methylated spirits. So that works against chytrid. And as James said, so does bleach, you know, at around about 5% concentration, if anyone was wondering.
Thank you so much, David. I'm so sorry, we are going to have to stop. We've gone way over time. So I just want to thank all our presenters today, our froggers, for their wonderful presentations. It sounds like there's lots of interest out there, and certainly there was lots of information. I know that the froggers wanted to present more, but we've sort of run out of time. And we do have, when the restrictions ease, we will be having lots of educational events, frog walk and talks out there for the kids to come, for anyone that's interested, not just at Merri Creek Management Committee, but all over Melbourne. So do have a look at those email lists that I put there. I will also add them to the on the chat. I've added them, but I'll also add them to the email lists as well of the different places that you can join some of us froggers to go out in real life and learn a bit more. But I'm sure a lot of you, people have been telling me already in chat that they're going to go out now after this with their family and go out recording frogs and going to some of those sites. So I think we can really thank all the froggers for their great advice today. I certainly learnt heaps as well. So I hope you all really enjoyed that. And thank you so much, everybody. Thank you for all the thanks in the chat as well. And yes, what about Central Victoria? We love frogs too. Yes, actually, Waterwatch in the Bendigo area, Central, actually do run, they have their own frog census in Central Victoria, and they also run their own events, Ruth, Mary. So do look up Waterwatch Central in the Bendigo region if you're interested in frogs in that area. Most Waterwatch coordinators around Victoria run their own frog events. So it's not just in Melbourne, it's all over Victoria. So thank you, everyone. Really, I'm glad you were able to make it today.